Good morning. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this year's Jeffrey A. Bader Memorial Lecture entitled U.S. China Trade Wars, A Conversation with Michael Froman. Jeff Bader was a leading thinker of his generation on issues related to Asia and China. Over the span of his very impressive career serving in the Department of State, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the National Security Council staff across both Republican and Democratic administrations, Jeff advised presidents, engaged with foreign leaders, and operated at the highest levels of American policymaking. He also served as the inaugural director of the Brookings Institution's China Initiative 20 years ago, which later became our John L. Thornton China Center today. But just as significant as Jeff's policy leadership was his role as a mentor. Jeff Bader consistently invested in cultivating the next generation of public servants and policy thinkers. Many of today's China scholars, both here at the Brookings Institution and across the broader policy community in Washington, point to his example and his guidance as formative for their own careers. Jeff's commitment to mentorship has ensured that America's capacity to understand and to respond to China is enriched by a diverse and highly capable new generation. To celebrate these incredible accomplishments, the Jeffrey A. Bader Memorial Lecture brings renowned speakers to Brookings in order to sustain his vital legacy of informing policy debates and educating the public on critical issues facing the U.S.-China relationship. I'd like to also welcome warmly Rohini Talala, Jeff's widow, who we are so pleased to have here with us today. We are truly honored that former U.S. Trade Representative and current President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ambassador Michael Froman, is joining us here today for the Bader Memorial Lecture. Over his distinguished career, Ambassador Froman has played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. trade and international economic policy. As U.S. Trade Representative under President Obama, Ambassador Froman steered America's trade agenda at a time of profound global change. And today, as President of the Council on Foreign Relations, he continues to be a leading voice on shaping economic statecraft and foreign policy. We're profoundly grateful to Ambassador Froman for sharing his unique perspective on how U.S.-China trade tensions have evolved, what lessons should guide policymakers, and how we can prepare for the challenges of the future global economy. There could not be a more timely set of issues today. My colleague Ryan Haas, Director of our John L. Thornton China Center, will moderate today's discussion. Just a quick reminder that today's event is on the record and streaming live. We invite those who are tuning in to send questions to events@brookings.edu or join the conversation using the hashtag Bader Lecture. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Froman and Ryan Haas to lead the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was a wonderful introduction to the event and remembrance of Jeff, which is the reason why we're all here today. But before I begin our interrogation, let me just thank you for crossing institutional lines, coming across town to represent the Council on Foreign Relations at Brookings today, but to honor Jeff. I'm going to structure our conversation around how I think about Jeff, the things that he prioritized. He cared a lot about leadership issues. He cared a lot about trade issues. He cared a lot about the U.S.-China relationship. So with your permission, we'll sort of follow that path. And let me just begin by asking how you got to know Jeff. What was your experience like with him?
Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you for doing this. Suzanne, thank you for having me. Rohini, it's great to see you again. And I'm truly honored to have been asked to do this because I viewed Jeff very much as a mentor, as an important colleague, as a great colleague, somebody you really enjoyed working with. Not all one's colleagues fall into that category, but Jeff did. And as Suzanne laid out, Jeff had a very distinguished career. We all know that the ultimate pinnacle of his career was working at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. This is really the highest form of public service that there can be. Now, I have to admit, I did not read Jeff's book when it first came out. And so in preparing for today, I went and I did what every Washingtonian does, which is to go immediate to the index and see where one's name showed up and what he said about you. And I just, if you don't mind,
Yes.
Ryan, I'd like to read a paragraph.
Gonna set the record straight here.
On the economic team, Larry Summers and Mike Froman were an incomparable duo. A friend of mine once said of another towering American political figure, America almost never produces quirky geniuses the way Europe does. Larry proved him wrong. Lots of people in Washington are bright, not like Larry. It was mortifying to present Larry with an argument and then have him deconstruct it, drawing out the absurd and destructive implications of what you were saying in ways you never imagined when you made it. I always emerged from a conversation with Larry feeling my brain had been at least temporarily jolted out of neutral gear. Mike was the perfect foil for Larry. All right, so Larry was brilliant. Mike was the opposite. Now he does go on to say, relentlessly practical and operational, a doer, the classic bureaucratic case of the person who ends up with every important task on a backbreaking schedule because he gets things done. So Larry was brilliant, I was the bureaucrat. That's the lessons that Jeff drew for me. I still view Jeff as a friend and a good colleague, notwithstanding. But we got to know each other, obviously in the first term of the Obama administration when Jeff was in charge of China policy and I was working on international economic policy, which of course had a lot to do with China. And so we were forced together. We worked, but we ended up really partnering very well together, and I learned a tremendous amount from him during those years.
Oh, that's great. On the topic of mentorship, if you could go back and provide a younger version of yourself in high school, college, or early career with advice, what would you tell yourself?
You know, I think what I would convey is that don't worry so much about trying to plan your future because life is what happens when you're busy planning something else, and be willing just to take risks as opportunities arise. I didn't anticipate actually this life. I knew I wanted to go into government, but I had a very different plan in mind when I came into government. That didn't work out in the way that I expected, and instead, wonderful things, alternative things worked out, including spending a good chunk of my life in the private sector and now at the council. And none of that, I think, was what was in the plan when I began. And so I think just being open to taking chances, don't worry about the planning, taking risks, particularly when you're younger and you can afford to take more risks, and just jump into it from there.
You've spent a lot of time around leaders, including presidents. You worked directly with President Clinton and President Obama. What lessons do you take from those interactions, those experiences about leadership?
You know, so many, but I mean, look, both I thought brought great intellectual rigor to the job, deep curiosity, wanting to know the history, the background, the details, but also, particularly in the case of President Obama, who I worked more closely with than I did with President Clinton, being able to take a step back, delegate authority. I mean, I felt very privileged in that administration. I think Jeff did as well, because the president listened, he took advice, he gave direction, and then he gave you the autonomy and the support necessary to go off and execute on it. He was not a micromanager, but he very much ensured that you had his direction in mind, that you had his vision in mind, but then had the autonomy and the resources at your disposal to make it happen.
Right. You now lead one of the most storied and prestigious institutions in America. The
One
Council
that I
for
just
Relations-
learned is 5 years younger than the Brookings Institution, so we're usually the oldest one in the room, but you are obviously more storied than we are.
Well, what lessons from government as well as private sector work do you bring to that role of leading this institution?
So, I think I've been, again, quite privileged to move between government, private sector, and the nonprofit sector, and I've always found having a perspective on how the different sectors approach issues and problems is very useful, because no one sector can solve these issues by themselves. And so being able to think about government policy but bring in an understanding of, well, okay, how do private sector players make decisions? How do investment decisions get made? Well, you know, how do you create jobs? Why do companies do the things that they do? And then also vice versa, when you're in the private sector, helping the private sector understand what is it that is motivating government, what are their priorities and their principles, how to engage with them in constructive ways, and how to ensure that we're partnering across the sectors, including the nonprofit sector, the think tank sector, to take the best ideas and execute on them.
Right. If I can turn us to trade for a moment. You wrote recently in Foreign Affairs that the global trading system is dead, not on life support, not in need of CPR, dead. You issued a certificate of death. Why did you do that? And what implication does it have for those of us in the room?
Well, look, I think President Trump may have put the final nail in the coffin of the multilateral rules-based trading system, but it had been under stress for some time. Yeah. I think we had seen over the last 15 years or so that some of the assumptions underlying it and some of the design elements of the World Trade Organization and the multilateral system were flawed and didn't fully take into account, for example, the nature, the significance, the importance of economy like China integrated into the global economy that was following a fundamentally different set of rules. Yeah. And so when we look back, I think there were lots of stresses in the system, and I think what President Trump has done is said, okay, it's over, and I don't think we go back to it, regardless of who's president after President Trump. I think we have to think through what comes next. Mm-hmm. What are the lessons of the last 80 years or the last 30 years since the WTO was created, and what are the lessons of this grand experiment that we're currently undergoing of tariffs, of bilateral action, of unilateral action, which I think is going to very much inform how we think about where we take the rules going forward.
And the international rules-based trading system can be seen as sort of an abstract idea at times, but it also has direct connectivity to people's lives. How do you think it'll be felt by my parents, your family members, those of us in the audience?
We're watching this day by day, I think, because obviously we're in a very different world from a tariff perspective than we were before. Prior to the first Trump administration, average applied tariff in the U.S. was about 2.5%. Now it's about 16%. I think the current tariffs on Chinese imports are around 57% right now, when you add up all the various sectoral tariffs as well as the blanket tariffs and the fentanyl tariffs. That cost has to be borne someplace. It's not free. And so there are three places it can be borne. The exporters can eat it. And if you're Walmart and you have a lot of leverage over your suppliers, you can get your suppliers to reduce prices to take into account tariffs to a certain extent or for a certain period of time. The importers, or whether it's a retailer or whether it's a manufacturing company that is relying on imports to be inputs into their manufacturing process, they will feel it, and that should show up in profits and expected profits, and that ultimately will show up in the equity markets as the markets make adjustments as to what the future profit trajectory of those companies are. And then ultimately, some portion of it's going to get eaten by the consumer, the end user. And that is probably the figure that people look at most at the moment. Inflation ticking up a little bit month by month. There's always a lag when it comes to tariffs. It's a couple months or a couple quarters. You don't fully see the effect until companies have sort of exhausted all other mechanisms of absorbing the cost. They don't want to lose market share. They want to remain competitive. And so I don't think we've seen the full effect yet. Now, the U.S. is less dependent on trade than a lot of other economies, than Europe, than Asia. And so it will be less catastrophic here than it might be in another country. But I don't think we can be complacent about either the current levels of the markets or the current levels of inflation, because I think it's still very much a work in progress that the system is absorbing.
You seem to have a bit of wariness, if I read your recent commentary correctly, about the use of tariffs as a tool to correct trade imbalances. Do you accept the diagnosis of President Trump that trade imbalances are an issue, a problem that should be addressed? And if so, what would you recommend doing instead to deal with trade imbalances?
So I do think there is a role for tariffs. There's always been a role for tariffs. When there are unfair trade practices and there's no other way of dealing with them to level the playing field. And so I don't think we should take tariffs off the table entirely. That's quite different than imposing a blanket 10% to 50% tariff on every country around the world, whether or not they have a trade deficit with us or not. I don't think bilateral trade deficits are as significant a problem as this administration does. I do think, over time, I mean, a lot of it has to do with our own macro situation, our own spending patterns. The trade deficit is a mirror of our own spending habits here.
Right.
And we need to have more savings here, which includes dealing with our fiscal situation, our deficit and debt situation. And other countries like China, not just China, also parts of Europe like Germany, need to move towards more consumer demand-led growth rather than export-led growth, particularly subsidized export-led growth with excess capacity that have a distortive effect on other countries. And that's kind of the world I think we need to move in. And the question is how to get there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about that.
That was a softball way of saying, why don't you ask me about that?
I would like to add a friendly amendment or
Okay.
addition to Jeff's characterization of you and Larry's role in the Obama administration, which is that you were more than just a doer. You were one of the most thoughtful practitioners of understanding the intersection between politics and policy. And as you look at this current American moment, is there space for serious conversation about reconceptualizing our relationship with trade? And if so, what would you like to see emerge as a consensus around the future of our approach to global trade?
Well, I think we need to have that conversation because right now we're going through the great disruption. At some point, we're going to need to get to what comes next. After the existing rules or the inherited rules have been turned upside down, what do we want to see the system look like going forward? And that's we may disagree with some of the means and the how of how the administration's approach is, but I think that's a healthy conversation to have, and one that has been bubbling along for some time as we saw support for trade go down among the American public, at least in some respects, and we saw the political reaction that came from that as well. So I do think we need to have a conversation about, where do we take international economic cooperation and the trading system from here? In the piece you referenced in Foreign Affairs, it's just shameless promotion of Foreign Affairs piece, I talk about open plurilateralism and how what we need is probably not a return to full 164 country multilateral negotiations with each country having a veto and nothing being able to be done except for the lowest common denominator, but rather coalitions of the willing, coalitions of the ambitious coming together around particular issues. For some groups of countries, that will be trade liberalization. I mean, it's been fascinating to see how TPP, even when the US pulled out of it, continued to proceed. The other 11 countries, now the UK, the EU's having conversations. There's a long line of countries that have said they want to potentially join TPP. Same could be said of the EU's free trade agenda with a lot of other countries, Mercosur and others. Africa having a continental-wide free trade agreement that's currently being implemented. So other countries may move ahead with trade liberalization integration. If the US isn't prepared to do that, we still have a need for working with other countries on secure supply chains, national security and export controls, foreign investment screens, industrial policy, coming up with common rules so we don't end up with beggar thy neighbor kinds of practices that are suboptimal. And I think that can then be the basis of building blocks for having rules, even if you don't have a fully multilateral rules-based system. So I think that's the direction we should head on. But I would say one thing, and particularly here at Brookings, which has such a tremendous domestic economic program and social policy program, domestic policies. The part that I think really needs attention, that Democratic and Republican administrations have failed to give adequate attention, is the domestic policy package that needs to accompany whatever's done on trade to ensure that American workers can survive and thrive in a rapidly changing economy. Most economists will tell us 80% of dislocation of workers is technology, not trade. But you don't get to vote on on software releases. You get to vote on trade agreements. You get to vote on immigration. And so immigration and trade become a bit of the scapegoats for dislocation. And we don't have, trade adjustment assistance has never been an adequate response. We don't have the kind of government and private sector approach to say lifelong learning, transition assistance, thinking about building for the jobs of the future. And the reason why I say that is whatever impact you think trade has had on jobs in the United States, and we've seen the estimates that perhaps China's entry into the international system created or caused 2 to 3 million manufacturing jobs to be lost. AI is going to have an effect that swamps that. And we still don't have any adequate policy response, domestic policy response to that issue. And that, I think, has much greater political ramifications than even trade.
Are you worried that the AI shock on jobs will reverberate to discussions about trade and limit space, policy or political space for?
Well, to be frank, I think it's probably the AI impact on jobs is far more important than anything having to do with trade. But yes, I think if people feel like the system isn't working for them, that they are alienated, that they're being left behind, that there's no response, I think it does lead to the kind of shift towards populism and nativism, protectionism, nationalism that we've seen over the last decade or so. And I think we need a better to take those concerns seriously, and then that better policy response.
Before we shift to China, can I just ask one final question on trade, which is, are you worried at all about a situation where it's sort of the world minus one, where the United States is stuck on the sidelines, or is the gravitational weight of the U.S. economy so big that that's not a concern?
So, I mean, I'm not too worried about it. I do think there may be fraying at the margins. And, you know, we saw the meeting in China a couple weekends ago with Modi and Putin and Xi holding hands. I don't worry so much about that because I think ultimately their national interests are what they are, and that will determine the degree of cooperation or tension that they have between them. But you know, you'll see countries hedging against the U.S. I think the U.S. continues to be not only the largest economy, but one of the most dynamic, resilient economies. We saw it coming out of the global financial crisis. We saw it coming out of COVID. And you know, we're the prettiest house on an ugly block. And so there aren't a lot of alternatives for example, on currency for people to seriously move towards. Again, there may well be adjustments at the margin, the bilateral trade between China and Russia being done in RMB, or between India and Russia being done in rupiah. But I don't see fundamentally the U.S. losing its central role if it deals with its underlying issues. I mean, I think, you know, economists, you've got some great ones here in the audience here, you know, have long been predicting that the current trajectory is unsustainable, and they're probably right. It's just without respect to time. Mm-hmm. And so there's always a risk that one predicts 12 of the last 3 recessions. You know, that you're always thinking that there's a crisis around the corner. At some point, they'll be right. But between our fiscal situation, our debt situation, creating frictions in the system, questioning the independence of the Fed, these are all things that could affect the dollar over time, but we continue to be quite a resilient and attractive economy overall.
So for the foreseeable future, it sounds like you are still very bullish on the dollar being the dominant.
I am. I mean, again, we are every day we take steps that maybe make that more difficult. And by the way, this is not limited to this administration. I think the weaponization of finance, the use of sanctions over time. When you're sitting in the sit room, you know, and there's a decision whether we send troops or do we impose economic sanctions, you almost always go for the economic sanctions. And so, you know, it's a natural tool to reach for. But again, it's not costless. And I think that's my main underlying message is, like, there are always trade-offs. Yeah. And sometimes we make those trade-offs explicit and debate them and say it's worth it. And oftentimes we don't. And I think policymakers need to do a better service for the American people if they make the trade-offs explicit, and it's a more durable basis of support to say okay, we're going down this road with the knowledge that there will be costs, but we're willing to pay that cost.
Mm-hmm. One of the other passions that Jeff had was China and Asia, and I'd love to get your diagnosis on what's going on in this current moment, particularly between the United States and China. How do you describe the trade relationship between the world's two largest economies today?
Under stress, I suppose. I mean, look, as I said, we have, I think, 57% tariffs on Chinese exports. I think they have 35% tariffs on our exports to them. What we've seen particularly over the last several months, that China has done quite a good job of discovering where they have leverage over the U.S., that it's not just the U.S. having leverage over China. So the decision back in when we hit 140% tariffs for them to cut off access to certain magnets, certain critical minerals, that was a shot across the bow, just to say this is one of several areas where we can have a stranglehold over the U.S. economy as well, and it led to a de-escalation. So we've seen escalation, we've seen de-escalation. Now there's talk about, we were talking about before, going, a potential summit meeting between President Trump and President Xi. The question is, are we going to actually deal with the underlying issues in the relationship? Because so far we haven't. And if you go back to Trump 1, the phase 1 agreement it was not a trade agreement, it was a purchase and sale agreement to sell some soybeans, to sell some corn, a few other things, LNG, I guess, commodities. We're suddenly a commodity provider to the world. By the way, love selling soybeans. Spent a lot of my time at USTR trying to open soybean markets and things of that sort. But we should be playing a more significant role than just as a commodity provider. And again, that agreement did not deal with the underlying issues. And so far in this administration, we have not dealt with the underlying issues. And to me, that's the hardest question in the U.S.-China relationship, because a lot of us, and chief among them, Jeff, spent decades trying to deal with the underlying issues, having these dialogues with the Chinese, pointing out what it is that they needed to do to be a more constructive part of the global economy, and in their own interest, very importantly, having a more balanced economy with less likelihood of there being bubbles and busts in real estate or in infrastructure or the like, but with only modest progress. And I think that what's incumbent on those of us who think about or work on China is to think, okay, what is the next phase of trying to influence or resolve these underlying issues? Can we actually influence Chinese economic strategy, or do they have to come to these conclusions on their own only after there's been some great pressure that they've had to face domestically or otherwise? Or are we left to just shaping the international environment in which China operates? And I went back and did some reading on what Jeff said about this. I mean, Jeff was incredibly pragmatic about the limits of our capacity to certainly not dictate, but influence Chinese policy, but also the need not to just accommodate it, to create facts that would hopefully over time lead them to the right conclusion. I think we've had some modest progress over the years, but I don't think any of us should be satisfied with the degree of progress. And what we didn't anticipate when Jeff was working, for example, on bringing China into the WTO, was that this trajectory under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji that we thought was sort of permanent, perpetual, it didn't go as far, as fast, and it turned out not to be as linear as we expected. And we did not anticipate, I think, President Xi, who came in and in some ways reversed it.
Right.
And that's the challenge that we now face.
So if you had an opportunity to lay out the underlying issues that you think we should prioritize in our conversations with China, what would be sort of your short list? Look,
the Chinese know this is nothing new here. I mean, the World Bank has talked to them for years about it. The U.S. government has, others. They've got to create a social safety net so that people don't save so much. You create a more consumer demand-led growth model so you're not so reliant on either real estate, infrastructure, or very importantly, exports. You think differently about excess capacity. Fascinating conversations with the Chinese where they're like, well, anybody who exports by definition has excess capacity. Well, that's not what the Chinese are doing. It's not just about exporting soybeans. It's about creating multiples of what they need for their domestic economy, and then using that power to drive out every other competitor around the world. And we've seen it in one sector after another. And I think China has benefited enormously from a benign international environment that allowed them to become a middle-income country. And I remember in our dialogues with Jeff and others over the Obama administration, we would consistently warn China that if we couldn't address these underlying issues, subsidies, the role of state-owned enterprises, excess capacity, intellectual property rights theft, et cetera, that benign international environment would disappear. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what's happened. And so the U.S. economy will be largely closed to their exports. Europe will have its own forms of protectionism, probably not as stringent as ours, but more than they tend to have. And the major developing, emerging economies, India, Brazil, Indonesia, others, South Africa, they're scared stiff of China dumping product on their markets. And so that may ultimately be the pressure when China doesn't have any place to send its excess capacity that ultimately requires them to look internally and do the reforms that have been talked about now for 2 decades.
Interesting. I have one or two more questions I'm going to pose to you, and then we'll turn it over to our audience. But you were talking about shaping the environment around China, and you spent a lot of time in your role as U.S. Trade Representative negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Thank you for reminding me.
And at the heart of that agreement was a sort of a view that Beijing would face pressure. They would either need to raise their standards to meet the requirements of entry, or they would risk self-isolation by being outside of it. Now, we obviously know what happened. The United States withdrew from what became the CPTPP. China is now applying to join. Where do you see this all going? The grand experiment of Asian trade architecture. And do you think the U.S. is capable in the future of playing a role in those discussions?
Look, I'm not staying up late hoping that the U.S. rejoins TPP. I don't think that's really possible politically. I think the countries in the region desperately want us to be engaged with them in some constructive economic relationship, in addition to everything we're doing on the military, political, strategic side of things. And I don't think we've really come up with an adequate replacement. And so hopefully in the future there'll be some degree of engagement there to further tie ourselves and these other countries to us. I mean, the goal of TPP was in many respects to give an alternative to these countries. China's going to have, it's been historically the largest economy in that region, for 13 of the last 15 centuries, right? Or it's a natural dominant Asian power. It's going to have a magnetic effect on all of its neighbors, and so it's quite natural for them to be pulled into that. And we wanted to make sure they had an alternative that was a high standard approach that dealt with issues like labor and environment and state-owned enterprises and subsidization, intellectual property rights, all the things that couldn't get done at the multilateral level in as strong a way as they should have been, and that continues to exist. I think it's hard for me to imagine, particularly on the trajectory that China is currently on, that they could meet the high standards of CPTPP. And so if the current members of CPTPP hold to those standards and don't buckle under the pressure of China, the diplomatic pressure of China, then I think China has a long way to go. But there are a lot of other countries that want to join. And it's, I think, how you build out something that it may not be fully multilateral, but if it represents 30, 40% of the global economy over time, it's a significant pull of saying these are a high standard set of rules that can help define and create predictability about international trade. So I think we are a Pacific power. I continue to believe that. I don't believe that the spheres of influence that some people talk about, that we should just be focused on the Western Hemisphere from Panama to Greenland is sufficient. I think we need to be very much involved in the Asia Pacific region, and I would hope we would find some way that's politically palatable and durable in this country to engage more constructively going forward.
That's great. That's a great note to end on and turn it over to our audience. Why don't we start with James Green, your former colleague and friend?
Thank you, James Green, recovering USTR employee. Thanks, Mike, for coming and for honoring Jeff. One of the things that struck me most about working with Jeff at the NSC 2 times was he was a very moral person and had a very strong sense that foreign policy had a moral element. And certainly we had plenty of fights with different parts within the bureaucracy about human rights and how important that should be in U.S. China relations. But remember, he would talk about Richard Holbrooke as being kind of a moral actor and deciding what he would work on, and that was an important part of how Jeff saw his role, I think, meeting with Tibetans often and putting that on the agenda. There's a lot of talk of trade, and I'd love to ask you lots of questions about kind of where the WTO is, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see the role for kind of morality and moral foreign policy for the U.S. and kind of globally in international affairs these days.
It's a good question. I think we're on firmest ground, and this predates America First, but I think it's very much underscored by America First. When we can demonstrate to ourselves, to the American people, and to other countries that what we're advocating for is fundamentally rooted in hard-nosed American interests. I think there's room for things like human rights within that, but I think frankly we're probably on firmer ground when we make the argument about why human rights are in the interest of the United States, the core national security interest of the United States, than to do so on purely moral grounds, because I don't think the moral grounds have as much resonance, at least at the moment, as perhaps they used to. I think it's been interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about this when Jimmy Carter passed away last year. It's sort of 50 years since he introduced human rights as a top priority for American foreign policy, and it strikes me there's a need to now go back and look at 50 years of human rights policy and say, what's worked? Where have we moved other countries? What hasn't worked? And what lessons, again, with clear eyes, do we draw from that going forward to the degree that these are issues that are really fundamental to U.S. interests? I don't think we've actually done that. I don't think we have a real clear-eyed view of how to take human rights forward as part of a foreign policy. By the way, I broadened it out from human rights. I think you could make similar arguments about global health, about poverty alleviation, about any of the development issues as well. I think increasingly foreign policy is becoming the dominant, and the U.S. foreign policy interests are becoming the dominant theme of our approach, and we need to figure out how these other issues fit into that.
Ambassador Rudd, you are a keen observer of China, a practitioner of trade, but also a close friend of Jeff. I'm putting you on the spot, but I just wanted to invite you if you want to weigh in at all on any of those themes.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
It's good that we're celebrating Jeff's remarkable contributions, not just for Americans, but for allies. He was well loved, respected, and we're also capable of telling allies when they're being sons of bitches.
Any in particular?
Never Australia. Here's a question for you, Mike. Given where we are at present, and given the parameters within which the administration is working on China strategy and China policy, then in terms of framing principles for the administration as they head towards conceivably a meeting either in Korea or elsewhere in the months ahead for what would constitute a useful strategy and policy for the US going forward, not just on trade, but more broadly?
So I have to admit, Ambassador Rudd, Ryan, I think you may have the answers to these. I have to admit to being a little confused as to where the administration is on China at the moment. Maybe Nick has an answer as well. I mean, early on, the administration seemed to have far more vitriol for Canada than for China, and seemed to be soft pedaling the China relationship. Then we had the trade spike and the de-escalation. And on one hand, I'm not sure the administration has resolved the question about whether we're going to leave spheres of influence to others, leave Eurasia to Europe and Russia to work out. We'll take care of the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure where that leaves Asia, and whether the administration's made the decision that, yes, it's absolutely critical to U.S. interests that we assert ourselves as a Pacific power, or whether we're reaching some modus vivendi with China around various issues. And it's hard for me to assess what this upcoming summit meeting, if it comes together, what the major deliverables might be, other than maybe an announcement about investments in the United States, or a slightly different tariff or something of that sort. But in terms of the underlying strategic principles that you've asked about, because the administration seems to be divided or uncertain about it. You certainly have a lot of China hawks in the administration, but then we see things like the review of AUKUS, and we're not sure exactly where that's going to come out. We've seen probably less enthusiastic defense of Taiwan's democracy and our commitment to defend Taiwan. And I worry that since this administration's policies on basically every issue is hard to discern absent the articulation of the president, is that we haven't yet seen where we actually stand when it comes to the Asia Pacific and China. So he certainly puts a lot of emphasis, or seems to put a lot of emphasis, on his personal relationship with President Xi and his capacity to negotiate directly with President Xi. But what big, beautiful deal is likely to come out of that negotiation, I think, remains to be seen. And so these next couple months could be very instructive there.
I'm a recovering State Department employee, James Patterson. I was in the audience in San Francisco when you and Secretary Vilsack were there speaking to the Commonwealth Club of California
That was a long time ago.
in support of the TPP.
Yeah. Were you one of the ones who booed me? Or?
No, I wasn't one. I wasn't one who booed you. I sat very quietly, but it was a free-for-all, or it broke down into a free-for-all. And I recall the police had to be called to take you and Mr. Vilsack out safely. Now,
Slight overstatement.
but what was your takeaway from that day?
Oh. So I have two photographs above my desk at home, and they're from my confirmation hearing as USTR. And the first one, you see me at the table and my parents and my wife, behind me, and you see in the background some fuzzy yellow figures. And the second one is a picture of the yellow figures. And they were a group of protesters who, halfway through my hearing, stood up, took off their jackets. They had T-shirts that said "Froman is a liar," and they started, chanting. And I keep them above my desk because it's a reminder that not everybody agrees with you, even when you think you're right, and that we should have a certain degree of humility about that. Look, I think TPP, particularly at that moment in time, and as we were watching support for trade among Republicans around the country decline, actually support for trade among Democrats rise, which was sort of interesting. But the changing political dynamic around trade was palpable. The timing was not propitious to bring an agreement like that to Congress. And I think we need to do, is one reason I emphasize we need more emphasis on the domestic companion of any trade agreement, to really understand how we're going to deal with people who are adversely affected by trade, to help rebuild support for international economic engagement. I actually think right now we're involved in this, this incredible historic experiment that the President Trump has launched, which I used to beg for reporters to write on trade, have forums to talk about trade. Now it's on the front page of every newspaper and in every digital outlet, and people are talking about it. Cab drivers are talking about it and things of that sort. I hope this will lead to a really interesting discussion about, okay, so what do we value in trade? Where are the limits of trade? How do we want to think about this? And hopefully coming out of this, we'll have something, we may not have a consensus, but we're going to have a much more educated public, I think, about trade than we've had before. And let's see where that goes.
We'll turn to Ryan in a moment, but on that point, the Economic Innovation Group recently released a poll that showed that President Trump's tariffs are deeply unpopular, that there is a 51-point margin on this, and that there is broad support into the 70s for free trade. And so if you accept those numbers, and you feel free to challenge them, why is it so hard to have a thoughtful, forward-looking conversation about the benefits of trade to the American people?
Look, I think there's a gap, and I think that gap is now in both parties between sort of what the rank and file and what the leadership and the major components of the political coalitions of each party believe. And so until that gap is managed, I think President Trump has a really interesting political challenge ahead of him, because if you look back on globalization, the benefits of globalization were felt by everybody, but were invisible. Nobody walked out of a Walmart and said, "Thank goodness for the World Trade Organization." But they were spending a smaller and smaller percentage of their disposable income, and particularly low-income Americans, on the things they needed to buy for their families: clothing, footwear, toys, back-to-school items, etc. And the costs of globalization were very visible, very acutely felt by a relatively small number of workers in a relatively small number of geographies. So I mentioned the 2 to 3 million lost manufacturing jobs that are associated with the China shock. That's 2 to 3 million over 12 years. We gain or lose tens of millions of jobs each year. People change jobs. Tens of millions of people change jobs each year. But it was that factory in Lordstown, Ohio, or Youngstown. Maybe it was the only factory, and putting those people out of work as that factory moved abroad, or was just simply put out of business. And the implications, the social implications that had, the economic implications, the fact that even under the greatest theories of creative destructionism, the replacement industries don't necessarily go back to the same places in a timely way. And so you have a generation of people who were going to lower benefit jobs, lower paid jobs, or not going to jobs at all. You had opioid crises, you had social issues, and then that had political ramifications with people reacting against it. And you can't go to people and say, yeah, but trade is still good in the aggregate. That's not what they feel in those places. And so we need to have a much more concerted way of thinking about it. What President Trump has done is flipped all this on its head. And so the costs of tariffs are going to be felt by everybody and be quite visible. Right? We're debating it every single day, right, all over the country. And the benefits, if he's right, that a wall of tariffs will bring more manufacturing back to the United States, that's going to take 4, 6, 8 years and be felt by relatively few workers in relatively few geographies. So it's the flip side of the problem of globalization. And I was meeting with some members of Congress yesterday, and we were having this conversation. How do you manage the politics to say, all right, you're all going to feel pain now, but trust us, in 6 years, somebody in a geography far from you is going to have a better job than they have now. By the way, so far, there's a lot of supporters of President Trump who very much still adhere to that. They see the pain, and they say, yes, we understand we have to pay a price, but if it works, it will have been worth it. Mm-hmm. And so he's made the calculation that there will be enough support along those lines. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but it is a tough political challenge, I think, to manage.
It's interesting. We'll go to Ryan next, but I also want to make sure we have gender diversity in our questions. So if anyone after Ryan would like to jump in.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ambassador Froman. Thanks so much, Ryan. I'm Ryan Fedashik, currently American Enterprise Institute, formerly State Department China House. I share your confusion about some of the recent policy reversals from the Trump administration, but it's clear that the administration is very focused, at least in part, on reversing this trend of American corporates losing market share to Chinese competitors in global markets in emerging tech specifically, and things like drones, photovoltaic cells, batteries, 5G equipment, the list goes on. What explains this phenomenon? In your view, is this just a story of industrial policy gone right in China? And what is the solution? Is it to fight subsidies with subsidies? What more do we need to be doing in the United States to maintain American competitiveness in emerging tech?
So I wrote another piece in Foreign Affairs last year, maybe this year, earlier this year. It was called China One, was the title, and it was a sort of a slightly tongue-in-cheek approach to say, for years we pressed China not to be protectionist, not to restrict foreign investment, and not to engage in industrial policy subsidization. And now we're protectionist, we're restricting foreign investment, we're engaging in industrial policy, and so we're playing on their playing field. We always knew there would be convergence between the US and China. We just expected them to converge to our model, and instead we're now converging to their model, and I think it's a harder model to compete on in the US system than it is there. I mean, others here, Nick and others will, China's wasted a huge amount of money on a lot of their industrial policy. There's, as you all know, they face huge challenges there, but they've had a concerted policy of investing in these key technologies that they want to be dominant in, producing excess capacity, subsidizing the heck out of them at the expense of other competitors around the world, and driving the others out of business. And I think that's been a concerted strategy. And the question is, can we get them off that path? And if so, how do we do it? Because we haven't been terribly successful up to now. And as I said, I think maybe the answer is that they're going to face this much more hostile international environment where one country after another closes their markets to them, and that forces them to look internally. Just think about, they have the capacity, I think, or they're on their way to the capacity to produce every car that is needed in the world. The number of cars that get purchased every year. If the US, Europe, and the major emerging economies are closed to them because they worry about the impact on their own manufacturing, where do those cars go? And what does that mean for their own restructuring that has to happen in their economy?
Thank you. Lauren Piper, Rhodium Group. Ambassador Froman, you have said the world trading system is dead. This is a view that I personally share, and you're interested in this idea of open plurilateralism. Understanding that the administration, has some mixed messages on trade and several different objectives that seem to be driving the current negotiations. That aside, I'm wondering if there's any room that you see for U.S. trade negotiations to lead to some sort of open plurilateral system with the U.S. and allies, and what would we need to see in negotiations to get there?
So I think you've highlighted a really important issue, which and Ambassador Rudd did as well. In my view, there's been insufficient attention by this administration to allies and partners. So everything from making a distinction between those products for national security or otherwise that we feel need to be actually made in the United States versus being able to rely on trusted allies and partners as part of a diversified supply chain. So things that we want to be less dependent on China for, or less dependent on Taiwan for, but can afford to take from Canada or Mexico or Europe or Japan, Korea, maybe even Australia. So I think that's one piece of it, is to really think through more what allies and partners can do with us along our interests. And then similarly, to build on that, can we pivot from simply dealing bilaterally with countries on tariffs to saying, here's an agenda of common interests, whether it's vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis other issues where the U.S. is willing to show leadership among a coalition of like-minded countries. And I'm hopeful there. And I was actually at a conference earlier this week with a senior Trump administration officials who started laying out, it was a totally different subject, but started laying out, yes, we need coalitions of the willing to come together and do this. And so I'm hopeful that this administration will see that there is value in bringing countries together. I think we have an interesting opportunity right now, which is, you saw earlier this week, the president or the White House announced there will be a G20 summit that the U.S. will host in Miami next year. That's going to be really interesting to see. What's the agenda of a Trump G20 summit? Mm-hmm. You know, because traditionally G20s are summits where countries come together to cooperate and to do things together. Is that going to continue? We'll have another theme to it. That's also possible. But I think there's an action-forcing event, which is what's the agenda going to be, and how is the U.S. going to lead the G20, a plurilateral organization, over the course of the next year.
Great. We have time for one last question, if anyone has a question they would like to put on the table.
Hi, my name is Sarah McCarg, and I'm here with the Asia Group. I was wondering, so you've talked about how it's a little difficult to infer what exactly the Trump administration's intentions are toward China, but on the other hand, side of government, we've seen that Congress is increasingly hawkish on China and seem to be coming to like quite a consensus on that. And so right now, they seem to be sort of taking a back seat as Trump is moving forward with executive orders and sort of taking the lead on trade. But do you see that sort of balance continuing, or do you think that that Congress may shift back to being more active and hawkish on China? And would that put tensions or introduce further complications into these trade negotiations?
I think there is a lot of concern in Congress right now about China, about support for Taiwan, et cetera. About export controls, the H-20 decision to sell chips to China and to have a financial interest in selling chips to China. But I've not seen a lot of examples of Congress standing up to the president on these issues. And so I think right now they're taking a back seat, and unless the politics of the relationship between the executive and the legislature change, whether it's the midterms or otherwise, I don't see a lot of checking by the Congress in that regard. Look, I think there are a bunch of big questions. I mean, this export control decision that I referred to, export controls are a really difficult technical area traditionally, where you go through and say this product is so central to our national security or our intelligence capabilities that we are willing to tell companies they cannot sell it abroad. They cannot sell it to the following countries. It's a rare occurrence, and it's constantly been updated to reflect developments in technology, because as technology develops, some of the old ones were readily available, and so you needed to upgrade it. To make export controls a trade issue and a chit in a trade negotiation makes it much more difficult both to do that hardcore decision making around what's in our national security interest, but also to bring other allies with us. Oftentimes, we need allies to work with us to restrain the export of products, and no government wants to tell their company you can't sell. You only do it in extremis, and you do it when there's a national security reason. And so I worry a bit about the precedent of making export controls a trade chit in a negotiation. Last thing I would say is on Taiwan. I think Congress is been quite bipartisan and firm in their interest in supporting Taiwan. Again, I'm a little confused on where the administration is on it, and I worry that when people talk about the negotiation of a fourth communique or some grand bargain with President Xi, that part of that could well be the president saying something like, of course we're not going to spill American blood for the defense of Taiwan. All we want is 50% of TSMC. And that would be entirely consistent with a transactional approach that starts with the commercial, but also reflects, what a number of people feel is probably an intuition not to get engaged kinetically in other conflicts. I worry that could fundamentally change our position in the region as well.
Well, Mike, we know that your time is in incredibly high demand. I'm so grateful for you
I have a
taking
dentist appointment later today. So thank you.
grateful for you taking the time to honor Jeff and share your insights with this group.
Thanks very much.